Hello, everyone. Welcome to the MintCast podcast. This is the official podcast of MintPress News, and I'm your host, Mnar Adley. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to invite you to join our Say No to Censorship campaign to help us continue to break through war propaganda by becoming a member of our Patreon. After being banned from TikTok and PayPal and having our funds seized, and then having our fundraisers on Indiegogo taken down and banned from there as well, we rely heavily on your financial support to help sustain our journalism, which names the names and exposes the war profiteers. So I will add a link in the comments and description below. Now, even though the world's attention is focused on Gaza and the mass student protests that have swept the country and now the world, many inside Israel are actually looking beyond the military incursion inside Gaza with their eyes all on Iran, seeing it as the country's ultimate enemy in the Middle East. Last month, Israel bombed the Iranian embassy in Syria, killing at least 16 people, including major Iranian generals. Now, in response, Iran launched a series of drone attacks against Israel. However, it became clear that neither the US or Israel nor Iran wanted to see any further escalation, despite hawks inside Israel and Washington warmongering their unwavering support for Israel to expand its bombings against the Islamic Republic. And of course, despite Israel being the one who launched the attack in the first place against Iran's embassy inside Syria, and Israel being the one openly committing genocide inside Gaza, targeting schools and hospitals, massacring women and children, and creating one of the worst human tragedies of our time, the media has been pushing anti-Iran propaganda to justify Israel's attack against Iran, framing the Islamic Republic as the aggressor and as the human rights abuser. And now that the dust has settled, as you could say, in that escalation, we are joined by Syed Mohammad Marandi, professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran in Iran, to learn more about these unfolding events and if it truly ended and where exactly are we headed. Welcome to the show, Dr. Marandi.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So after 7 months of the bombardment of Gaza, as well as an attack against Iran from Israel, how exactly is the mood in Iran right now?
Iranians have always been very supportive of the Palestinian cause. Has always been a minority of Iranians that have been indifferent or who've been critical of Iran's policy to support the resistance and the Palestinian people. But overwhelmingly, Iranians have supported, ordinary Iranians have supported the government's policy with regards to Palestine. But now, even liberals or pro-Western liberals in Iran who have usually been more critical of government policy or the policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran with regards to the Palestine issue, even the mood among them is shifting, and they are becoming more hostile towards the regime. People across the country are seeing the scenes in Gaza and Palestine. So I would say that what Israel has done has shifted the mood across the world. I mean, I've been to China. I've been invited to China twice over the past few months. I've been to Russia a couple of times. I've been here and there, and you can tell how the mood has changed everywhere. And even friends in India tell me that initially there was a lot of pro-Israeli rhetoric coming out of India, but as the scenes of genocide began to increase online, and it's not like it was during the early days or weeks. But so in Iran, it's like everywhere else. From the very beginning, a strong majority supported the Palestinian cause. A small or a minority were critical. That doesn't mean they were pro-Israel. It means that they were sort of saying, or they were saying, many of them, it's none of our business, or we should not give so much support. We should just give humanitarian support. But even, as I said, even the mood among this minority has shifted. Of course, it's anecdotal for me. It's based upon my experiences in the last 7 months, colleagues and relatives and friends who I speak to show and speak of this shift.
Now, it was widely reported that Iran sent mostly its slowest and least powerful weapons and missiles and drones at Israel and tipped off Israeli and American authorities long before it commenced. So, from an Iranian perspective, what exactly was the point of that missile strike on Israel?
So, in Iran, the mood became even more hostile towards Israel. The polls, I mean, over the years, I've seen many polls. And as I said, a very strong majority of Iranians consider the Israeli regime to be illegitimate, and a very strong majority have always supported Iran's support, military support, and humanitarian support for the Palestinian people. And but as I said, I haven't seen recent polls. So when I say even the liberal minority has changed, it's based upon my own anecdotal experiences. And one of those experiences, or some of those experiences, have to do with after the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy. And you could see the anger among ordinary Iranians and the expectation for the Iranians to strike back at the Israeli regime. So what the Iranian government did was they waited 10, 12 days. They played mind games with the Israelis, but also they wanted to go to the UN and to use the diplomatic tools at their disposal to marginalize the Israeli regime and its supporters. So at the UN, as you know, the United States, Britain, and France, they prevented any condemnation of the airstrike on the Iranian embassy, and which is amazing. And but the whole of the global South, they were outraged, and even countries that have been sort of standing in the middle, their governments being cautious, they too showed anger and outrage and support for Iran. So after that, the Iranians decided to strike back. But what they did, I think, was quite interesting. And that is that they used, and I don't know the exact numbers, but they used a couple of hundred old drones, which they launched from Iran, and they announced it effectively to the public. So people knew that the drones were on their way. When the drones reached close to Israel, the Iranians also fired cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. Most of these drones, I mean, these drones were all old drones, as you said. They didn't have any of Iran's newer technology. And many of those missiles, most of the missiles were the same. They were older missiles in stock. The objective was for the Israelis and the Americans to use all of their resources, to combine their resources, and to force them to show their hand. So Iran gave them ample time. They basically said that we're going to carry out this attack. They warned the countries in the Persian Gulf not to get involved, and that if you do, if you allow the Americans to use their bases in the Persian Gulf, we'll punish you for it because you'll be seen as hostile. So everyone was given ample warning. The Americans mobilized everything they had, the British, the French. They brought everything that they had. So the Iranians launched these drones so that the Americans and the Israelis and the others would fire their surface-to-air missiles, which are very expensive. And there's a big shortage of them in the world because of the war in Ukraine. In Ukraine, these missiles are constantly being used against Russian drones and missiles as well. So the Americans prepared themselves. There are over 150 aircraft in the air, 100, I think almost 160 actually. And the Americans brought their ships closer to the shore, and they did everything they could to bring down those drones. So the Iranians were expecting those drones to be downed, but this was a a very cheap way to force the other side to spend billions of dollars, and B, a very good means for intelligence gathering with regards to what the Israelis and the Americans and the others have, without giving anything away. So in future, if we have a second wave or third wave or fourth wave of strikes with the Israeli regime, they won't know what we have, and they won't know what our capabilities are. And their resources would have been drained, and we would know a lot about them. So they were decoys and intelligence gathering information, but also they were there to deplete their Israeli and American resources. So when the drones that were decoys forced the Israelis to, and the Americans, because the Americans did most of the work. They downed most of the drones. When these drones forced them to fire at them, and the older missiles did the same, the Iranians sent newer generation missiles, not the most advanced, but newer generation missiles, something between 10 and 20, to strike targets inside Israel, and they all got through. And that's an important point. They didn't even use their best missiles, but those missiles did get through. They hit a base in the south, an air base where the F-35s are stationed, which bombed Gaza, but also which bombed the embassy. And they struck a military intelligence base in the Golan Heights with missiles. And the Israelis, despite the fact that these are the two most well-protected bases in the world, literally, they couldn't stop Iran's missiles. So Iran effectively depleted their resources, their missile defense capability, and they showed them what they can do. And the Iranians say that over 50 Israelis were killed. Iranian intelligence says that, but the West is pretending that nothing happened. But the evidence that shows the Israelis failed and that the Iranians have the upper hand is the very fact that the Israeli regime didn't strike back. The Americans were very worried about an Israeli response because they knew the Iranians were going to hit much harder. And the Iranians had prepared between 1,700 and 1,800 drones and missiles of a much better quality, more advanced, for an immediate counterstrike if the Israelis struck back at Iran. So we saw this fake Israeli attack on Iran, which I think was, even if they hadn't done it at all, it would have been better for them. But it was, I think, the Israelis humiliated themselves in this. And so since it was really a non-attack, the Iranians, who were prepared to hit them very hard, just let it go.
Well, Iran has certainly done more than most of Palestine's neighbors in helping the people there. It has also been aiding a number of armed forces in the region, including Ansar Allah in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon and in Iraq as well. What is the extent of Iran's support, and what is the rationale behind this?
Well, one thing that I should also add is that the Iranians have also changed their policy towards the Israeli regime. The fact that they struck an Iranian embassy gave Iran an opportunity to change this policy. And they say that from now on, if the Israelis attack Iranians, whether it's an embassy or if they just attack them somewhere in Syria or Lebanon or elsewhere, the Iranians will strike back from Iran. So that is a new policy. And that makes it much more difficult for the Israeli regime in future to target Iranians or assets that are affiliated to Iran in Syria. Because as you know, Syria has for decades been a very important country in Iran's assistance for the resistance, whether Hamas or Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad, all of them, and other smaller Palestinian groups across Palestine, that country has been important. The one reason, or the key reason, if not the only reason, why the West and unfortunately some regional countries carried out a dirty war against Syria was because they knew the role that Syria is playing. So in future, it's going to be more difficult for the Israeli regime to target Iranians in Syria. And I think that's going to strengthen Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah as well. Now, the reason why Iran supports all these groups is because Iran doesn't consider the Israeli regime to be legitimate. Iran's policy has been from day one that Israel is an apartheid and illegitimate regime, like apartheid South Africa. In fact, before the revolution, in the statements made by revolutionary leaders, these two foreign policy issues were at the top of the list, and that they were saying that Iran must break off ties with South Africa because during the Shah's time we had good relations with South Africa, and that Iran must break off ties with Israel. And so they did that after the revolution, and Iran supported the resistance against South Africa. Iran supported the ANC military wing, as well as the political wing and other resistance organizations. And then when the apartheid regime in South Africa collapsed, Iran established normal ties with the country. And Iran has very good ties with South Africa today. With regards to Palestine, Iran has the same policy, that this regime is not legitimate and that it must fall, and that we must have a Palestine that includes Jews, Christians, Muslims as equal citizens and as equal human beings. And that is the only acceptable solution for the Iranians. In other words, the only legitimate solution, the only moral solution. And that is why Iran has been supporting the resistance, whether, as you pointed out, Ansar Allah or Hezbollah, but of course, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. I think it's very, you asked about the extent of Iran's support. I think it's quite clear that the tunnels and the weapons capabilities and the technology that exists in Gaza, which has prevented the Israeli regime from being able to take it after 7 months, that is due to Iran's support for the resistance groups, which have bravely stood up against the regime and have used that technology and that infrastructure and those weapons to deal an extraordinarily powerful blow against this racist, ethno-supremacist regime. And I think it's quite extraordinary that after 7 months, the Israeli regime has gotten nowhere, and have no doubt that if they attack Rafah, they will be defeated as well. During the very first day of war, maybe the first 2 or 3 days, I spoke with people in Iran who know what they talk about when it comes to the region, the people who know military matters, and they were saying Gaza will not fall. And many of my Palestinian friends, some of whom you know, they were very worried during the first days, and they contacted me, and based upon what these people were telling me, I told them that Gaza will not fall, and they proved to be absolutely correct. So Iran's extensive support for the resistance, whether in Gaza or elsewhere in Palestine, as well as in Lebanon and Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, is based upon its ideological belief that this regime is illegitimate. Iran's anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist position is, I think, very clear. And the antagonism that the West has shown towards Iran over the decades is all about Palestine. All of these sanctions, Iran has suffered tremendously over the decades because of Western policy. It has nothing to do with the nuclear program. It has nothing to do with human rights or terrorism or anything like that. These are all just excuses for the West to be able to put pressure on Iran because of Iran's position on Israel. And it's quite extraordinary that the West openly supports racism and apartheid, yet condemns Iran for supporting equality among all people in the land of Palestine.
Since Israel's attack on Iran's embassy, the media has been framing Iran as the aggressor and as a major human rights abuser. What do you make of this media coverage in the West?
Well, it's, I think, important for people to keep in mind that the same media that is whitewashing the genocide in Gaza, the same media that is supporting ethno-supremacism and justifying all the evil acts of the Israeli regime, and looking, the same media that is looking for ways to justify this slaughter, to make people accept what outrageous crimes are being committed. This is the media that is antagonizing Iran. This is the media that is calling Iran evil. And so I would, first and foremost, advise people to rethink everything that they've heard about Iran. First of all, I'd say that people should visit Iran and come and see Iran for themselves. In fact, many people don't need visas to come to Iran. But Iran is a country that is very dynamic. And for example, they constantly speak about women in Iran. The dean of my faculty is a woman. I've been a professor at the University of Tehran, or an academic at the University of Tehran, for 20 years. And in those 20 years, I think 17 of those 20 years, the dean has been a woman, 2 different women. Sometimes for a number of years, the head of my department was a woman. So my boss and my boss's boss were both women. The last person who we hired in my department, the English language and literature department, was a woman, a female academic, a very smart and competent young lady. And I'm an affiliate in the American Studies department at the University of Tehran as well. The last 2 academics that we hired in that department were both 2 very bright young women. So the 2 departments I'm involved in combined, we had the last 3 people were women who were hired. So my boss is a woman, my young colleagues are women, most of my students are women. We have women pilots, we have women taxi drivers, we have women truck drivers, we have women scientists, we have this is very different from what is said in the West. It's very interesting. In the West, on the one hand, they say that the Iranian regime is said to make it seem illegitimate and unstable. They say the Iranian regime is despised and that people hate it and that it's corrupt and that it's unpopular, it's falling apart, it's about to implode. But at the same time, they say it's a growing menace, it's a threat to the world. How can something that is so weak and vulnerable and about to implode be simultaneously a growing menace to the world? These inconsistencies in the narrative on Iran are so enormous and so widespread that if someone looks carefully, they can see that. And now, when we look at what's happening on American campuses, at UCLA, where thugs are sent in to beat anti-genocide protesters, and the police are used at different universities, and in particular in New York, in Columbia University, to crush the protests. I think it's things are becoming more clear when Congress is narrowing down freedom of speech, and the U.S. government is harassing young people across the country. And as TikTok is being banned because the political order doesn't want young people to see what's happening in Gaza, I think it's becoming clear that the real problem with regards to human rights is in the West. Across the world, they support despotic regimes, family dictatorships. They keep saying that the Arabs want peace with Israel, but the Arabs that they're talking about are a bunch of dictators that they've installed on the streets. Everyone is opposed to the Israeli regime, not only in the Arab world, but across the global South. So they installed dictatorships. They have narrowed down the scope of free speech and the right of assembly in the West and in the United States in particular, and they're supporting genocide and apartheid. So I don't think they are really in any position to talk about Iran or human rights in Iran or anywhere else for that matter anymore.
Right. And I want to follow up on your point of media coverage and the use of the word regime to describe enemy states. You recently were invited to debate TV host Piers Morgan on the subject of Iran, Israel, and Hamas. And it was certainly a fractious interview. While Piers constantly attacked and pressed you, you gave it back to him. It was quite impressive. I want to play a short clip for anyone who hasn't seen the interview. Take a look.
Piers, let me give you a word of advice. Your media outlets, regardless of whether Russia or Ukraine is good or bad, that is another issue. Your media outlets in the West have been misleading the people for 2 years now, saying Ukraine is winning, Ukraine is winning. Suddenly, everyone is saying Ukraine is falling apart. Dishonest narratives and reporting dishonestly to your own people ultimately hurt the people of England and Europe and the United States. And your endless wars based upon this nonsense and this misinformation lead to huge waves of refugees. And then the people of Europe feel overwhelmed by these refugees that you yourself brought upon yourself.
And now, during the interview, Morgan constantly referred to the Iranian government as the regime, like you described, something which you had fun with. In fact, after the interview, Piers wrote that, "I didn't agree with almost anything you said, but appreciate you coming on the show to let us hear the Iranian regime perspective," to which you replied, "I didn't agree with almost anything you said, but appreciate you inviting me on the show to respond to the British regime perspective." Now, that made a lot of people laugh. And, but, there was an important lesson about the use of the language of the word regime and the demonization here, that the word regime is reserved only for official enemies. Talk to me more about this in your experience.
Sure. Well, yeah, you're exactly correct. And of course, I did respond to that. And I think I don't recall because it was I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks ago now. But I did tell him that when you speak about these Arab countries, I think that's what I said, that you're talking about a few family dictatorships. You're not talking about the people on the streets. And I would add now that any Arab regime or family dictatorship that chooses to enhance ties with Israel or even continue ties with the Israeli regime, they're undermining their own legitimacy. They're going to increase anger towards themselves. And one day that may blow up in their faces. We already saw what happened in Turkey. The Turkish president, by refraining from cutting ties with the Israeli regime and cutting trade, one of the reasons why his party did so poorly is because some of his own supporters turned against him and voted for another Islamic party, a much smaller party, but that 5-6% caused them to lose the local elections. Fortunately, now we're seeing a shift, hopefully, in Turkish policy, and we are hearing that they're going to cut off trade. If that's true, that I think is an important step, and hopefully they'll cut off ties altogether, and hopefully that'll increase in pressure on the United Arab Emirates and others to end their relationships with the regime. But yes, the West likes to use this sort of terminology in order to delegitimize the other side and to show themselves as the legitimate authority which can judge, which is the judge and jury, and they are the ones who are able to tell the world what is right and what is wrong. So for example, even in this tweet of his, he said you were able, I came on to give the position of the Iranian regime. In other words, he's not even acknowledging that I'm an academic. He's not acknowledging that I have an independent perspective, that my views are the views of an academic. He would never say that to, let's say, a professor at an American university or at a Western university. He would not say, I thank you for coming to express or explain the position of the regime. He would never say that, or the administration. You don't see that on CNN or Fox News or any media outlet. Why? Because they are academics. They are unbiased. That is, the West is the land of knowledge and discussion and debate and reason. But in our part of the world, we are regimes, especially Iran. Iran is, the axis of evil. We're fortunately, we're the only country that is a part of all the different the two we have a couple of decades ago, Bush called Iran, North Korea, and Iraq an axis of evil. And now it's Iran, Russia, and China that are the axis of evil. So the only country that's been in both is Iran. We have that very important status. But so in the case of Iran can't, as someone like me, is not legitimized in the eyes of, or at least he tries not to legitimize me and what I have to say. So if he speaks to Professor Mearsheimer, he will call him a professor, and he will argue with him. And he lost a discussion with him. I just watched it today. Someone asked me to see it. He lost the debate, and then he was very, he praised Professor Mearsheimer. But when it comes to me, he would never do that. I'm just like a regime spokesman. I'm just a mouthpiece, the way he presents me. So I think there's this is very Eurocentric. This is, in my opinion, racist. And the truth is that he is the one, in my opinion, who cannot really tell the truth. And I would advise your audience to take a look at the debate between the two of us. It's clear. One thing that I stressed during the debate, because he wanted me to condemn Hamas, and I will never condemn Hamas. Under no circumstances. The resistance against Israel is legitimate. The 7th of October, from my perspective, is completely legitimate. And I explain, and he attacks me for it, but I have no problem with that whatsoever. But the point is that when he was talking about the rape allegations and the beheadings and the allegations of beheadings, I said, show the evidence. If you can, right now, as we're carrying out this debate, you have a team, you have a crew, have them show pictures of the beheadings, have them, blur them, so no one has to see anything, but show the beheadings. You can give us evidence of rape. You don't have to, literally show it, but with all the cameras and all the technology that exists today, you don't have one single piece of evidence to prove this. But even though he didn't have any response to what I had to say, he will not say that, there's no evidence of rape. There's no evidence of beheadings. And that, I believe, is because he can't. He can't go there. That's my opinion. Those who repeat these lies are doing so to enable genocide. They are giving the Israeli regime cover through these lies to kill women and children. That is what they're doing. That is the objective. And therefore, they are foot soldiers in this genocide.
Now, many in the West have declared Ansar Allah, or AKA the Houthis, to be a terrorist group, making the seas unsafe for shipping, according to the US. But the United States itself has a history of capturing Iranian vessels that not many in the West are aware of, that have included vessels carrying oil and aid headed towards Venezuela. So talk to me about this hypocrisy of US policy on this issue and the successes of Ansar Allah, considering their small resources.
Yes, but also before that, I'd like to focus a bit on Ansar Allah. I mean, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the resistance in Iraq and Syria, they've all been very heroic. And so have their supporters who've helped them fight the Israeli regime. In the north, they failed. In Gaza, they failed. In the West Bank, they failed. And in Syria and Iraq, everywhere they failed. The Iraqi resistance and the Syrian resistance have forced Americans to stand back, because if the Americans join in the fight, they know that they're going to be kicked out of Iraq, literally, and Syria as well. But I think even something that is greater than what perhaps these groups have done, all of them, is what Ansar Allah has done to the United States. They went and enforced the Genocide Convention and blockaded Israeli ports. And what did the Americans and the British do? They went and said, we're going to, stop Ansar Allah. And they couldn't. The Americans and the British and the Europeans and the Canadians, all of them for a decade, helped the Saudis and the Emiratis carry out genocide in Yemen. And they were defeated. Here, the Saudis and the Emiratis, despite Western full support, in fact, the Americans carried out a starvation siege in the Red Sea to starve the people in Yemen, to bring them to their knees so that the Saudis could win the war. But look how the Ansar Allah has turned the tables. How the Americans came in, said, we're going to, stop these attacks, and they couldn't. And they failed. And Ansar Allah, which has survived a decade of genocide, they've defeated the superpower. Not Israel. They've gone way above Israel. They've defeated the United States in the Red Sea and their sidekick, the British. And now Ansar Allah is blocking British and American shipping because they attacked Yemen. So the Yemeni armed forces, the Yemeni government, and Ansar Allah, they've defeated the superpower. And they have strengthened the hand of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and everyone by defeating the United States and by not being intimidated. So they are maybe the great heroes of this the unexpected, the unsung heroes, let's say, of this war. Hamas, Hezbollah, all the others have done extraordinary work, and I think the most heroic of them all are the people of Gaza, who remained steadfast and held their ground. The women, the children, the men, the civilians and citizens, the Palestinians who stood their ground. They're probably the greatest heroes of all. But the greatest unsung hero, I think, is Ansar Allah, which has been able to defeat a superpower when just a few years ago, this superpower was enforcing a siege starvation against them in the Red Sea. And they did it for the sake of Gaza. And the Americans were willing to give Yemen, Ansar Allah, everything they wanted for them not to continue this enforcing this the Genocide Convention, and to stop blocking ships from going to Israeli ports. But Ansar Allah refused. They could have, just like Iran. Imagine what the Americans would be willing to give to Iran today to stop its support for the resistance, just as military support. If the Iranians just gave verbal support like other countries to the Palestinian people and stopped the military support, what do you think the Americans would give to Iran? They would give Iran the world.
Yeah.
But Iran will not halt their support. And the good news is that as we speak, more tunnels are being built in Gaza. New recruits are coming in. New weapons are coming in. Ammunition is coming into Gaza. The Israelis have lost the war. And the more they continue this genocide, the greater the defeat will be. They failed in Gaza. They failed in the West Bank. They failed in in Lebanon, and they failed against Iran, and the US has failed against Yemen. The more this continues, the worse it is. But the biggest defeat is the genocide. This is the biggest defeat because the Israelis have exposed themselves to the world. They've turned the world against them. And those who support the Israeli regime have exposed themselves, and they've destroyed themselves. They've destroyed their image across the world. The United States and Western regimes that support the Israelis, they've demolished their credibility. So the greatest defeat, in my opinion, is not the military defeat, whether against Iran or Hezbollah or Hamas and its allies or Yemen. The greatest defeat has been the unprecedented crimes that have been committed against the Palestinian people. This genocide is unique because it has been shown to us live. This is the first genocide that we watch. We watch events as they unfold, and simultaneously we watch Western regimes support this genocide. This has never happened before. We've heard about it in the news, something terrible is happening in country A or, in country B. But here we're watching it. It's happening in front of our eyes, and the West supports it. So this makes it unique in history. It is the first genocide that we are witnessing happen, and the West has destroyed itself. Americans have hijacked numerous Iranian ships. So when they complain about blocking Israeli ports, it's utterly hypocritical. Iranian ships that have been taking oil to Venezuela, to China, and to other destinations have been stopped by the Americans and stolen. And the oil has been stolen, just like they're like pirates. They are pirates, just like what they're doing in Syria as we speak. For over a decade, the Americans have waged a dirty war in Syria. They supported ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they've destroyed the country. They've murdered hundreds of thousands of people, the Americans and their allies in Syria. But then they imposed sanctions. They've occupied a third of the country, and they're stealing the oil, and they're stealing the wheat from the areas that they occupy. And that's where all the oil is, and that's where most of the best agricultural land is. So the Americans, when they steal Iranian oil, it's for them, and the Western media behaves as if this is normal. They don't say that our government is acting as like a pirate. So Ansar Allah didn't steal any ships. They didn't steal any oil. They said no ship must go to Israeli ports. No ship must leave Israeli ports until the genocide stops. Very simple. The Americans carry out theft. Ansar Allah implements the Genocide Convention. There's a world of difference.
I want to switch topics slightly to 2018, when the United States walked away from the JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. There have been reports that Iran is enriching uranium. So can you tell me more about, what is the status of the Iranian nuclear program? And talk to me about this allegation that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon that we've been hearing for literally decades.
Iran isn't developing nuclear weapons. Iran has said that it does not have any intention to produce nuclear weapons. But Iran will continue to develop its peaceful nuclear program within the framework of international law, and the Americans cannot stop that. And so once the deal fell apart, thanks to the Americans, when the deal was signed under Obama, the United States violated the deal from day one. And then under Trump, they just simply tore it apart. So the Iranians, who had fulfilled their side of the bargain and shut down a large segment of the nuclear program to show their good intentions, the Iranians, after waiting between a year and 2 years, they restarted their peaceful nuclear program. And now it is one of the most developed nuclear programs in the world. And of course, the Iranians have made an implicit threat that if the Israeli regime strikes, or the Americans strike anything that's linked to the Iranian nuclear program, Iran could leave the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the IAEA. So the American, of course, Iran's nuclear, and this is something that I think is also important to note. What Iran has done over the last couple of decades is that it has created underground installations across the country. Many of its key installations, whether nuclear or military or anything that's strategic, are now underground, and so well protected against missiles and planes. And that same policy, as you see, has been implemented in Lebanon by Hezbollah. Their military capabilities are all underground. The Israeli regime cannot destroy them. There are many more tunnels in Lebanon than there are in Gaza. And actually, the only and Hezbollah has given many martyrs during the last 7 months, between 250 to 300 martyrs. But if they were able to fight the way that they would normally fight, their casualties would be much lower because they have many underground capabilities. But since they want to keep the fighting on the border to prevent the people from inside Lebanon and central and northern Lebanon from being effective, they're forced to fight in a way in which makes their soldiers more vulnerable. So Hezbollah, if there's an all-out war with Israel, the Israeli regime, Hezbollah's underground capabilities are far greater than that of Hamas, because Hamas is surrounded. Hezbollah is not. They can bring in new weapons, and they can build tunnels and underground cities, and that would make it impossible for the Israeli regime to win. So Hezbollah is underground, Hamas is underground, Ansar Allah's assets are underground. That's why the Americans can't destroy them. Their radar systems, their drones and missiles are all underground. So the Americans can fire as many missiles that they want, and they can carry out as many airstrikes as they want, but they can't damage the military infrastructure of any of these resistance partners. So the Israelis can't damage any of the key and sensitive parts of the Iranian nuclear program because they're very well protected. But the Iranians have said that their policy with regards to the NPT and the International Atomic Energy Agency would be reviewed if there are any strikes against the Iranian nuclear program.
My final question to you, Dr. Marandi, is about U.S. sanctions. And in part because of decades of U.S. sanctions, the Iranian economy has been going through a very difficult time. But Iran has sought increased economic cooperation now with new partners such as Russia and China. And Iran has also recently been successful in joining BRICS, making new partners with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So what will this mean for Iran's economy going forward? And if Iran is now trading with BRICS nations more easily, does this spell the end of the effectiveness of American sanctions against your country?
Well, U.S. sanctions are already weakening. And you're absolutely correct. Iran has been able to join BRICS. It has been also invited to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which it joined as well. And Iran has enhanced its ties with neighboring countries, regional countries. And since Russia has been sanctioned by the West after the conflict in Ukraine began, Russia's relations with Iran have increased dramatically because in the past, the Russians were cautious because they were afraid of sanctions. Now that they've been sanctioned, their trade relations and business relations with Iran are very easy because both sides are sanctioned. So both sides are very comfortable with each other. And so the trade relationship and the military relationship between Iran and Russia has enhanced dramatically. And also the more that the Americans pressure China and antagonize China, the closer China grows to Iran. And as the West is declining and the global South is rising, that increases Iran's options too. And of course, um, now that Russian oil and Venezuelan oil and everyone's oil is being sanctioned by the Americans, Iranian oil sells very well too. So things have changed. And I think that as we move forward, countries that see the United States weaponizing the dollar and weaponizing financial institutions, they are going to find better means to trade without using the dollar and without using Western financial institutions. So the West has marginalized itself by perpetual wars, by constant wars, by overusing by weaponizing sanctions, by weaponizing the dollar, by weaponizing financial institutions. They've created incentives for countries to work together to weaken those sanctions, to weaken U.S. hegemony and domination. And I think that the ongoing war in Ukraine, which has also weakened the West considerably, because when they sanction Russia, they're sanctioning themselves. When they stop doing importing gas and fuel from Russia, they weaken and ruin their own economy. So the West is economically and militarily on the decline. And now with the genocide in Gaza, the soft power of the West has also been destroyed. The West is rapidly declining on all fronts. And to be very blunt, that is good news for Iran, because countries are increasingly ignoring the West. The global South is looking for ways to marginalize the West and to build a meaningful multipolar order. Not that Iran hates the West. If in the United States there was a sea change in foreign policy and a normal government came to power, and if normal governments came to power in Canada and the UK and France and across Europe and Australia, then Iran would welcome good relations with these countries. But as long as we have these abnormal supremacists and exceptionalists and Eurocentric regimes in power in the West that support dictatorships, ethno-supremacism, and the starvation of people and the suffering of people, whether it's through the genocide in Gaza or through dirty wars or through sanctions that target women and children, then I think it's going to be impossible to normalize or to have normal ties with Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin.
Dr. Marandi, it was truly a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.